Have you ever noticed how your brain constantly pulls you toward the easiest option? How it whispers, rest, wait, maybe later, even when you know the hard path is the one that leads to growth? What if I told you that this resistance isn't a flaw? It's a signal that you're on the edge of transformation. Today, we're going to uncover how to train your brain to crave the hard things, to chase discomfort, and to build a version of yourself that thrives where most people quit. This isn't about motivation. It's about rewiring your mind to make strength, effort, and progress unavoidable. Number one, your brain is wired for comfort, not growth. Your brain is wired for comfort, not growth. And that single truth explains why most people sabotage their own potential without even realizing it. The human brain was designed for survival, not success. It prefers routines, predictable outcomes, and minimum energy expenditure. Anything unfamiliar or difficult feels like a threat, even if logically you know it could transform your life. That's why you hesitate before starting a workout, why you delay a difficult conversation, why you talk yourself out of new opportunities. Your brain's first job is to keep you safe, and safe often means staying exactly where you are. Discomfort signals danger, even when the discomfort is the doorway to growth. As long as you let this default programming run your life, you will always drift toward the easiest path, even if that path quietly destroys your ambition. This comfort wiring becomes even more powerful when paired with modern life. Your brain evolved in a world that demanded effort, hunting, building, surviving. But now the world offers endless shortcuts. You can get dopamine without discipline, distraction without purpose, stimulation without progress. Your brain quickly learns that easy rewards feel good and require nothing from you. Every time you choose the comfortable option, you reinforce this loop. You teach your brain that comfort equals safety and that effort is something to avoid. And once that becomes your internal pattern, it becomes incredibly difficult to take action on the things that matter. Not because you're lazy, not because you're unmotivated, but because your brain has been conditioned to retreat from anything that stretches you. To expand beyond this wiring, you have to create a conscious break from your default mode. You must start observing when your brain pulls you toward the easy way out and recognize that impulse as an outdated survival mechanism. This awareness alone gives you power. When you understand that resistance isn't a sign to stop, but a sign that your brain is doing what it has always done to protect you, you can begin to separate your identity from your impulses. You realize you don't have to obey every feeling of hesitation. You can override your instincts. You can choose discomfort on purpose. And when you do, you start teaching your brain a new pattern. That challenge is not danger and effort is not suffering. Little by little, the unfamiliar becomes familiar, the difficult becomes normal, and the actions that once triggered fear begin to create a sense of strength. Number two, micro wins rewire your reward system. Micro wins rewire your reward system because your brain learns through repetition, not intention. Most people believe they need a massive breakthrough to change their lives, but the brain isn't transformed by big victories. It's transformed by consistent, small ones. Every time you complete a tiny challenge, something subtle but powerful happens. Your brain releases a small dose of dopamine, the chemical that signals this is good, do it again. The win itself doesn't have to be dramatic. Waking up when the alarm rings, doing a 5-minute workout, drinking water instead of reaching for sugar, writing one paragraph instead of waiting for perfect motivation. Each of these moments sends a message to your brain that effort leads to reward. Over time, this repeated cycle becomes a neurological habit. The brain starts to expect satisfaction after effort. It begins to crave the feeling it gets from follow-through. This is how you shift from someone who avoids hard things to someone who naturally leans toward them without forcing discipline every single day. The reason micro-wins are so effective is because they bypass the brain's resistance. Your mind might panic at the thought of a huge task, but it won't panic at the first tiny step. A 5-minute action feels harmless, manageable, and safe. And because it feels safe, your brain allows you to start. But once you start, something changes. Momentum begins to build. And momentum is the psychological bridge between intention and identity. When you show up for yourself in these small ways, you stop seeing effort as a threat and start associating it with competence. You prove again and again that you are capable of following through. This proof reshapes your self-image far more effectively than waiting for motivation ever could. Micro wins make the brain feel successful quickly and often, which is exactly what rewires a reward system conditioned by years of avoiding discomfort. What makes this process transformative is that micro wins create a positive feedback loop. You do something small, you feel good, you repeat it. Your brain begins to anticipate that feeling every time you engage in a task that normally triggers resistance. Slowly, the emotional weight around hard things dissolves. The tasks that once felt intimidating become neutral, and eventually, they even become satisfying. You begin to chase the feeling of progress rather than the feeling of comfort. This is how micro wins turn into macro growth, not because the tasks themselves are big, but because they shift your brain's pleasure center away from instant gratification and toward long-term fulfillment. And once your brain starts finding pleasure in effort, you become unstoppable in ways you never imagined. Number 3, your identity changes before your habits change. Your identity changes before your habits change because every action you take is ultimately filtered through who you believe yourself to be. People often try to build new habits without first shifting the internal story that drives their behavior, and that's why they fail. If deep down you still see yourself as someone who procrastinates, someone who quits when things get uncomfortable, or someone who never follows through, then your brain will keep guiding you back to behaviors that match that identity. Your habits are a reflection of your self-perception. You don't act according to the person you want to become. You act according to the person you believe you already are. Identity forms the foundation of behavior, and if you don't challenge that foundation, you end up stuck in the same loops, repeating the same choices, even when you desperately want to change. This is why real transformation often begins with an internal shift, long before it shows up in your daily actions. Changing your identity means creating a new mental blueprint for yourself, one that aligns with the life you're trying to build. This isn't about pretending or forcing fake confidence. It's about recognizing that identity is fluid and can be reshaped by your intention. When you intentionally choose to see yourself as someone who does hard things, someone who values discipline, someone who honors their commitments, your brain begins searching for actions that validate that identity. Humans are wired to stay congruent with what they believe. If you believe you are capable and consistent, you will unconsciously look for ways to prove that belief true. This is why identity comes first. It sets the direction for your habits. Without a shift in self-image, you might start a habit, but you won't sustain it because it doesn't match the narrative you hold about yourself. But when the narrative changes, sustaining new habits becomes far more natural because they now feel like an expression of who you are rather than a forced contradiction. The process of identity change begins with small commitments that reshape your internal dialogue. Every time you do something slightly outside your old pattern, your brain collects evidence that contradicts the old identity. When you choose discipline over comfort, even in tiny ways, you're signaling to your mind that you're not the same person you used to be. These signals accumulate and slowly shift your sense of self. Over time, you begin to identify as someone who follows through, someone who faces challenges rather than escapes them, someone who takes action without waiting for motivation. And once that internal shift takes hold, your habits naturally fall into alignment. You no longer have to push yourself as hard because your actions start flowing from a deeper place, from the identity of the person you are becoming instead of the limitations of who you used to be. Number 4, discomfort becomes addictive. Discomfort becomes addictive when your brain begins to associate it not with danger, but with self-respect, progress, and personal power. At first, discomfort feels threatening because it disrupts your routine and demands more energy than your brain wants to give. But when you repeatedly choose to lean into that discomfort, something begins to shift on a neurological level. You train your brain to understand that the feeling of being stretched, challenged, or pushed is not a sign that you should stop. It's a sign that you are expanding. And the moment your brain links discomfort with growth instead of fear, the entire meaning of effort changes. You stop seeing difficult things as obstacles and start seeing them as opportunities to access a stronger version of yourself. This psychological shift is subtle, but once it begins, it accelerates quickly. Every time you step into discomfort, you get a small internal reward, a sense of pride, certainty, and capability. That feeling becomes something your brain starts to crave because it confirms your worth in a way comfort never can. The addictive nature of discomfort grows stronger when you realize how boredom, stagnation, and ease drain your sense of aliveness. Human beings are built to evolve, and deep down, you know when you're not challenging yourself enough. Comfort might feel good for a moment, but it slowly erodes your confidence because it gives you nothing to prove to yourself. Discomfort, on the other hand, becomes a source of energy. It wakes up parts of your mind that remain asleep when life is too easy. It forces you to sharpen your instincts, activate your discipline, and rely on your deeper strengths. Over time, choosing discomfort begins to feel like choosing growth, and choosing comfort begins to feel like choosing regression. This internal conflict flips your natural preference. Instead of avoiding hard things, you start feeling uncomfortable when you avoid them. You sense that you're shrinking. You sense that you're betraying yourself. This internal pressure eventually creates a new psychological pattern, the desire to chase challenges because they make you feel alive, capable, and aligned with your potential. As this new pattern solidifies, discomfort becomes less of an emotional shock and more of a familiar environment. You develop a tolerance for uncertainty, pressure, and challenge, and this makes you more resilient than the average person. Tasks that once felt overwhelming begin to feel routine, and tasks that once intimidated you become your new baseline. This progression builds a remarkable kind of internal momentum. The more you expose yourself to discomfort, the more your brain learns to enjoy the chemical and emotional payoff of overcoming it. It begins releasing dopamine, not from ease, but from effort. And once your brain starts seeking that feeling, discomfort stops being something you fear and becomes something you actively pursue, not because it's pleasant, but because it brings you closer to the strongest version of yourself. Number 5, remove emotional negotiation. Remove emotional negotiation because it is the silent force that destroys consistency, discipline, and personal progress. Emotional negotiation is the internal conversation you have with yourself every time you know exactly what you should do, but your feelings begin to interfere. It's the hesitation, the bargaining, the "I'll start in 5 minutes," or "I'm not in the mood right now" that creeps in right before you take action. When you let these negotiations happen, you hand over control of your life to your temporary emotions instead of your long-term goals. Your feelings are designed to fluctuate. They're influenced by fatigue, environment, hormones, distraction, and countless triggers you can't fully control. When you rely on them to dictate your behavior, you become inconsistent and unpredictable. You get trapped in a cycle where you only act when you feel like it. And that's a dangerous standard because the things that matter most, health, growth, discipline, long-term goals, rarely feel convenient or comfortable in the moment. Removing emotional negotiation is about refusing to give your feelings the final vote when it comes to your life's direction. The power of eliminating emotional negotiation lies in the clarity and decisiveness it brings. When you decide that an action will be done no matter how you feel, you release yourself from the exhausting burden of arguing with your own mind. You stop wasting energy debating simple decisions, and you start moving with purpose instead of hesitation. The truth is, emotional negotiation is a form of self-sabotage disguised as self-comfort. It tricks you into believing you're being gentle with yourself, when in reality, you're reinforcing a habit of avoidance. Every time you allow emotions to talk you out of taking action, you strengthen the identity of someone who can be easily derailed. But when you stop negotiating, even in the smallest of moments, you start building a radically different identity. Someone who honors commitments, someone who follows through, someone whose actions are anchored in intention rather than mood. This identity becomes the backbone of real discipline. It's not about becoming robotic or emotionless. It's about recognizing that your emotions are temporary, but your goals are not. When you remove emotional negotiation, you create a psychological environment where action becomes automatic. You stop asking yourself, "Do I feel like doing this?" and start living by the standard of, "This is who I am, so this is what I do." This shift reduces resistance because it leaves no room for debate. It removes the mental friction that makes even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Over time, this builds an extraordinary level of self-trust. You begin to trust yourself to act consistently, to stay aligned with your goals, and to rise above momentary discomfort. And as this trust grows, so does your momentum. The more you act without negotiation, the more power you reclaim over your mind, and the more your brain begins to associate discipline with stability and strength. This is how you break the cycle of emotional inconsistency, not by waiting for motivation, but by removing the negotiation that stands between you and the life you're trying to build. Number 6, build a dopamine loop around effort. Build a dopamine loop around effort because your brain is always searching for patterns that predict reward, and whatever it learns to associate with pleasure becomes the behavior it naturally gravitates toward. Most people unknowingly build dopamine loops around distractions, scrolling, comfort, junk food, procrastination, because these things deliver instant satisfaction with zero effort. Over time, the brain begins to expect quick rewards, and anything that requires patience, discipline, or delayed gratification feels uncomfortable and unrewarding. But the truth is, you can retrain this system. You can teach your brain to release dopamine not from ease, but from effort. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It's built through repeated experiences where effort leads to a small, meaningful sense of internal reward. When you finish a workout, complete a difficult task, or push through resistance, you create a psychological imprint. Effort equals progress. Progress equals satisfaction, and satisfaction equals dopamine. Eventually, the anticipation of that feeling becomes powerful enough that your brain starts to crave the behaviors that create it. This process begins by intentionally rewarding effort, not results. When you only feel proud of yourself once you achieve something big, your brain receives dopamine too infrequently to build a habit around hard work. But when you celebrate the act of trying, showing up, pushing yourself, taking the first step, you give your brain consistent reinforcement. This consistency is what rewires your motivational system. It shifts the focus from "I only win when I achieve something major" to "I win every time I act in alignment with my goals." This mindset makes hard tasks feel less overwhelming because the reward is no longer delayed. It's embedded in the action itself. Over time, your brain begins releasing dopamine the moment you engage in effort, not just when you finish. This anticipation becomes a driving force. It pulls you toward challenging tasks instead of pushing you away. You begin to seek the feeling of effort because it signals growth, progress, and control over your own mind. As you build this dopamine loop, your relationship with discipline transforms. Hard things no longer feel like punishment. They feel like opportunity. Tasks that once drained you start to energize you because your brain has learned to associate effort with emotional and chemical payoff. This is where true momentum is born. The more effort you put in, the more dopamine your brain rewards you with. The more dopamine you receive, the more you crave the behaviors that generate it. This creates a self-sustaining cycle that makes consistency feel natural instead of forced. The loop becomes internalized. You stop relying on external motivation because your brain now finds pleasure in the very thing it used to avoid. And once effort becomes a source of gratification rather than a source of dread, you unlock a level of discipline, drive, and resilience that feels almost effortless from the outside, even though it's built entirely on your willingness to rewire your own reward system. Remember, the life you want is built not on comfort, not on fleeting motivation, but on deliberate action, repeated daily. Every time you lean into discomfort, push past hesitation, and act before you feel like it, you are rewiring your brain, reshaping your identity, and creating a version of yourself that thrives on challenge. The hard things are not obstacles. They are the gateways to strength, clarity, and freedom. Start small, stay consistent, and let your effort become its own reward. Step into the discomfort today, and you will thank yourself tomorrow.